Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right side of the screen. Time permitting, we will get to as many of them as we can. My guest today is Professor Rajan Menon. Dr. Menon is Director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities, Bernard Spitzer Chair in International Relations at the Powell School, City College of New York City, University of New York, and is a Senior Research Scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace, Columbia University, again in New York. Dr. Rajan is a prolific writer of books and articles, especially those these days, on the political and economic consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war. Please welcome to Polaris-Live, Dr. Rajan Menon.
Sarwar, thank you very much for the generous introduction. It's good to be back with you.
Rajan, it's always good to be back with you. You're one of the most original thinkers that I know of. So thank you for taking the time to join us. So let me ask you, our topic today is the so-called Quad, which is much in the news these days, especially being touted by the U.S., Rajan, as a potentially significant counter to China's increasing influence in the Indo-Pacific. Help us understand where the Quad came from and what it is, Rajan.
So if I may presume on your patience and that of your audience, let me broaden the lens a little bit to put the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue, in perspective. It is said in the U.S. these days that we lack bipartisanship, but I think you'll agree, Sarwar, that on one issue, there is more than enough bipartisan consensus, and that is that China is either a peer competitor in the 21st century or the biggest threat. And President Biden is no exception to that hawkish outlook. Witness that his China czar, Kurt Campbell, said the era of engagement is over. Campbell's deputy, Rush Doshi, whom you may know, wrote a book which was titled China's Grand Strategy to Displace the United States. So there's no question that there is a bipartisan consensus. There are roughly three perspectives on China in the US, as far as I can tell. One is the perspective of Professor John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, who argues that right from the beginning, allowing China to enter the global economy, allowing American investment, allowing China to enter the WTO was a mistake. We have created, in his words, a monster, and that the competition will inevitably escalate into war. The second is that China will become part of the global economy, part of global institutions, will become something of a stakeholder, but there will be great power competition and jostling to shape those institutions, so China has a bigger voice. The third and receding point of view has been that over time, globalization and interaction with the global economy and global polity would make China gradually transform into a more liberal society. That view, if not out the window, then much less popular. So this brings us to the Quad. And the quadrilateral security dialogue was, as you know, a brainchild of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, thought of it in 2007. 2021, March, it held its first dialogue. It is not entirely clear to me, and I'll stop with this so we can pursue the conversation, what exactly is it? Is it a talk shop? Is it a club to coordinate policy on a whole variety of issues? Is it a budding alliance? And the future alone will tell exactly what it's going to be.
Well, Rajan, that's an interesting place where you stopped. And I think it's important for our audience, if you agree, to understand that the origin of the Quad really was after the tsunami in the 2018, was it? I've forgotten the exact year. And that Australia and Japan and India especially thought that Asian countries should link together to help this catastrophe. Isn't that where it started? And how did it come to where it is now, Rajan?
It did start there as a practical proposition, but the idea, as I mentioned, was always going back to 2007. I think there's several things going on. I think there's the United States concern with the rising China. I think there's India's concern with China, especially the threat on its northern flank and its need for not allies, because the Indians don't sign alliances, but partners to balance China. There's Japan's and Australia's increasing concern, but it is also indicative of a transformation of the US security relationship with India, which in the Cold War era did not exist. And even the political relationship was at best correct and at worst of times testy and hostile. India is now being greeted as a strategic partner, and much is expected of it as a market, as a buyer of American military equipment, and as a potential balancer against China. So there are all those things going on. Australia and Japan, of course, have been longtime American allies. I will just add very briefly that the coming together of these four countries for security purposes is not entirely new. As you well know, starting in 1992, I believe, in the so-called Malabar exercises, the navies of these countries have exercised together. Not all of them have been present at all times. So there is a kind of backdrop, if you will, for the Quad in this respect.
So, Rajan, I had actually forgotten how far back the Malabar exercises go. But, a question that arises to me, and I suspect for some of our readers, is India's always been part of this so-called non-aligned set of countries, although it doesn't exist anymore. But because of colonialism and so on, and you and I originate, from that kind of that time, that thinking, that India has always been very reluctant to join in alliances, especially with the West, right? So that's one the piece of it. The other piece is Russia and India have always had this brother to brother relationship. How does all this come together with India now becoming much more hawkish and joining the West? Supposedly, anyway. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, you've asked, as usual, a very good question. I think that the Indian reluctance to join alliances, for all the reasons that you mentioned, is present, notwithstanding the demise of the Congress Party, which for most of India's independence was the ruling party, and the advent of a right-wing Hindu nationalist, much more hawkish on defense, BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the Indian People's Party led by Narendra Modi. But even under Modi, India has shown no indication that it wants to join an alliance. Now, why not? First, as you mentioned, there is a kind of allergy to alliances and dependence that may hark back to India's history as a colony. But more immediately, it seems to me that India would like to reap the benefits of a strategic partnership with as many countries as possible, in this case, the United States, Australia, and Japan, without entering into a military alliance which would needlessly antagonize the Chinese and also the Russians. So it wants, as it were, to not form a military alliance in the literal sense of the term, but to reap the benefits of security cooperation. Now, all of this hinges upon exactly what the Quad becomes. And there, I don't know how you feel about this, but I think the jury is out on what exactly it will become.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. And it also seems to be a changing model as one views it these days. Because correct me if I'm wrong, Rajan, but there's already talk of a Quad 2.0, which might include Vietnam, which might include New Zealand, which might include Philippines and other countries in there. So it seems like the Quad is morphing. And that's a good point, good place, I think, for me to say that what does this mean to you, especially in view of the fact the allergy that you've so eloquently described that India has for military alliances. And I'd like you, if you don't mind, to now widen this lens even further and bring in the Ukraine war, where, if India is going to be the linchpin of the Quad, as I think the U.S. Wants it to be. And here it is now, not even joining the West in criticizing Russia's, involvement in Ukraine. Can you tie these loose strings together? Perhaps that'll give us some clarity on the Quad.
Well, I'll do my best. So the first part of your question has to do with Quad 2.0, that is increasing the membership. Now, that can be touted either as a success or one could raise questions about it. So let's start with the proposition that it could be a success. 2.0 means that more countries find the Quad attractive. Now, this the Chinese have made clear they do not like. They have issued warnings to Bangladesh and thereafter at an ASEAN meeting that other countries ought not to join the Quad. So there's no question that Beijing, for obvious reasons, does not view the Quad as a friendly organization, doesn't like this trend of a security coalition coming together against it. Now, one could argue, on the other hand, on the debit side of the ledger, if you will, that a coalition that is still embryonic, that is yet still to clearly define its raison d'etre, becomes even more amorphous and incoherent by increasing the membership. So it depends on how you look at it. I'll say one final thing. The question about the Quad in my mind is this, if it becomes some kind of a security operation, anything other than an American-led security coalition with a multilateral veneer? Because as far as I can tell, the only country that can project and sustain forces off China's doorstep in the East China Sea and South China Sea is the United States. The Indians cannot. They have in purchasing power parity a China that has a GDP 3 times as much. On research and development, the Chinese spend about 8 times as much. On military spending, it's about 3 times as much. And then you have Japan, which of course is committed to a kind of pacifist posture that may change. And then you have Australia that has to travel 7,000 kilometers away to get there. Now, on the war in Ukraine, it is correct that India has not lined up behind the West and forthrightly condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is that. It's not a special military operation, as Mr. Putin likes to call it. Now, why is that? The first thing to understand is that India and the Soviet Union, and subsequently Russia, have had a strong political and military partnership, although not and never an alliance, since the mid-50s. So there are, if you will, what economists call sunk costs. There are legacy costs from walking away from this relationship. In terms of military imports, during the Cold War, again, Sarwar, as you know, the Russians or the Soviets had a lock on the Indian market. About 80% of Indian weapons came from the Soviet Union. Today it's down to 50%, 49%, but that's still a very large number. So there are costs to taking a position and publicly breaking with the Russians on Ukraine, a state which they consider extremely important to their national security. I think India also believes that standing up and condemning Ukraine, that if the Indians do it, it'll have not much effect on Russian behavior. It will probably be detrimental to the Russian-India relationship. But in the end, somebody has to be left standing who's seen as more or less neutral if there's a role of mediation to be played. Now, can India play that role? I don't know. The most immediate thing that the Americans have taken notice of and are putting pressure on India, or at least cajoling it, is that India has been buying Russian oil in large amounts. Now, let me hasten to add that before the war, Indian imports from Russia were a rounding error, less than 1% compared to Europe's 20%. Now it's up to about 8 or 9%. The Russians are giving them discounted oil. The one shoe to drop, which we don't know, is whether India's decision to proceed with its 2018 agreement to buy the S-400, the most sophisticated Russian air defense system, will expose India to so-called CAATSA sanctions. That remains an open question. President Biden could offer a waiver, but there are some who are already thinking about applying those sanctions.
Well, Rajan, you introduced this topic of trade between India and Russia. But let me throw this out to you. As you know, in the last 8 years, China's investment and business and trade with India has increased quite a bit. I mean, in spite of everything that's going on, the Himalaya, war, not war, but conflict that took place, and everything else, that investment hasn't stopped. So, is India? What can America expect as far as this issue of trade between India and China?
I think you're quite correct, Sarwar, that China is now, I think, the second largest trade partner of India, as the
Indeed.
recent figures that I can look at have shown. And that is likely to continue. So is investment in both directions. So the Indians gain from that, the Chinese gain from that. Neither has any incentive to break that relationship. From India's position, the optimal stance would be to continue the positive aspects
Mm.
of its interaction with China that it benefits from, such as
Right.
trade, without becoming overly dependent, whilst having on the security side a coalition that is not an alliance but is enough to signal to Beijing that India does not stand alone in the event of trouble with China. So it gives India maximum flexibility. That is, as a signal to the PRC, but without signing away its independence and breaking with this tradition of non signing alliances. That's the optimal. Now, much of it depends on what kind of country China becomes. Does it become a great power that competes with the United States? Does it become a hegemon that seeks to displace Pax Americana with Pax Sinica? We don't know yet. And so it really depends on the degree to which China poses a dire security threat to India and whether that threat increases.
But Rajan, you brought up an interesting point. You've made 3 points there. The first of which has to do with whether China wants to become a great power, right? And but don't you think that with the speed with which China has been developing, I mean, depending on which economist you talk to, it already has the largest economy, though it's not the richest country in the world, that is a trajectory that will automatically come, that it'll become a great power. I'm not certain, perhaps you can add some intelligence to this, whether China really wants to dominate the world as America does right now. But there's no doubt in your mind that China will become a great power, right? And probably be the dominant power in Asia Pacific, or am I wrong?
No, you're right, Sarwar. If you take a historical perspective, China has been absent as a major force in world politics and the global economy for about 500 years. And the way Chinese look at history in terms of thousands of years, that's a blip on the screen. So, in a sense, they've returned to what they see as a rightful position. Now, you and I are old enough to remember that when Mao died in 1976, China was a peasant country because of the reforms that Deng Xiaoping introduced in 1978, integration with the global economy, more markets, more private property, and so on. The average growth rate has been, correct me if I've got this wrong, 7 to 8% since 1978. No country that I know of has sustained that growth. So the question is not whether China becomes a great power. It already is. The question is what its added economic and military muscle will amount to in terms of what role it would like to play in the world. I think at the moment it reaps enough benefits to not want to upset the apple cart by engaging in any kind of reckless war or confrontation, absent any crisis in Taiwan.
Well, that's exactly the point that I was trying to get to, because it just seems so. All our conversation here, Rajan, points to that the apple pie that is being baked, as far as the Quad is concerned, is still not complete. The crust hasn't come about. Everything hasn't, gelled and so far. And and do you think, and what I'm doing here is transitioning to a brilliant article that you wrote about the global economic impact of the Russia-Ukrainian war. I mean, you pointed out in very dire terms what the developing countries, Latin America, Asia, and so on, are going to be like as a consequence of this war, leave alone the poor people in Ukraine and so on. So what I'm asking you is, we've talked about the difficulties the Quad will face. India is supposed to be its linchpin, the difficulties it will face with India having the historical model of relationships and alliances. What I'm going to ask you is, tell us a little bit about this economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine war. And do you think a long-term model of the Quad might return back to where it started after the tsunami of self-help in that part of the world?
Right. On the economic aspects of the Ukraine war, the first point to make is that we have by no means, not by a long shot, and you know this because you have extensive experience in the business world, we have not felt the full effect. So let me begin in concentric circles, starting with the most immediate one, that is Ukraine. Just one figure. The Ukrainian finance minister estimated not long ago that if you add up all the destruction of physical plant and infrastructure, lost revenue from foregone exports, because most of Ukraine's exports are seaborne, and that coast is basically a war zone, the southern coast, and the decline in GDP, the price tag comes to over $600 billion. That is a vast sum. So, under the best of circumstances, even if Ukraine manages to expel Russia from the territories it's occupied since February 24th, when the war began, best case scenario, it is now a devastated country that will need substantial help, and it will take decades just to reach a kind of pre-war normalcy. Now, for the West and Europe, higher interest rates, slower growth, more inflation, and the higher interest rates will come about, of course, to tame inflation. But the countries that may have it worst of all are the low-income countries. They are already facing significant food shortages. Russia and Ukraine together account for a big chunk, although not a majority by any means, of wheat and corn exports. When it comes to sunflower oil, which is widely used in cooking, 80%. On top of that, higher interest rates in the West means the debt burden of low-income countries will increase substantially. The default by Sri Lanka has its own internal dynamics, but one has to ask whether this is the first domino and whether other defaults will occur. So the consequences are really dire. And the question really is for the Ukrainians, once the costs of the war, higher energy prices, higher food prices, slower growth, increase in unemployment, if all of that happens, will some level of Ukraine fatigue set in? Now, on the Quad, could it in the long run be a coordinating entity that has some role in financing Ukrainian reconstruction? I believe that was your question. I would say the United States has the wherewithal, Japan has the wherewithal, Australia has some wherewithal, India not much. This is going to be essentially an enterprise, a reconstruction of Ukraine, that will largely be borne by three entities: the IMF, of course, which is funded by wealthy countries, the United States, and the EU. I think the Quad could play some kind of role, but I think it will be peripheral.
Which brings me, as we head to the tail end of this conversation, another headline that is currently making the rounds, which is the U.S. Federal Reserve's determination to stomp out inflation. Right, as you may recall, during President Jimmy Carter's times, we had rampant inflation, and Mr. Paul Volcker was hired by Mr. President Carter, and he came in and really stomped out inflation. But as a consequence, there was a tremendous rise in unemployment in the U.S. Right? So, based on what you have said, and I ask this because there's a budding, brilliant economic historian, Jamie Martin from Georgetown, who wrote this article last week, actually, saying that the United States has to be very careful in fighting inflation and how tough it wants to be, because it might wind up repeating that so-called lost decade after Mr. Volcker went to work, when Latin America, Asia, Africa suffered an enormous unemployment and recession. So what I'm asking you now is, help us tie together Ukraine, this fight against inflation. Won't, if the Federal Reserve really stomps down on inflation, produce the result that you have just said, amplify it, that Ukraine may take 2 decades instead of 1 decade, that there'll be a worldwide recession? And how do you think America should behave in that situation?
As you know, the Fed's move to raise interest rates is the second move by a central bank. I think a day before that, the Indian Reserve Bank of India, the Indian central bank, raised interest rates by, I think, 40 basis points. I think this is the beginning of a trend, because when inflation kicks up, central banks raise interest rates. But there's always a delicate balance, as you well know, Sarwar, between how much you raise interest rates to curb inflation and at what point do you raise it further and start choking off the economy. That's the delicate balance. Now, inflationary trends and the disruption of global supply chains and so on were evident before the Russia-Ukraine war, and were evident even during the pandemic. There was a debate between Larry Summers and Paul Krugman about whether there'd be inflation. Krugman has lost the debate, but now he says there'll be inflation, but it'll be short-term. But what does short-term mean? So there's no question that the global economy is beginning to feel the pinch, and I think the pinch will become more painful. There's no question about it. Could we see stagflation as we did in the Reagan era? I doubt it. I'm not an economist. I'd be surprised if that happens. Some people have murmured that word, stagflation. That suggests that there is enough anxiety about it to start talking about it.
Well, before we wind up, I just want to press this point a little more. Right now, it seems as though America's position has been publicly voiced by the defense secretary and the president that our aim now is to weaken Russia in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the poor Ukrainians are paying the price for this by seeing their country destroyed. Don't you think it just might be better, especially in view of the economic consequences that you and now Jamie Martin in his article have pointed out, if the United States would also take leadership in trying to somehow settle this Ukrainian war? So perhaps, we end on a positive note by getting your thoughts on that, and maybe a couple of ways we can do that.
Sure. There's an odd parallel between our discussion just now about interest rates and inflation, what's the correct balance, and what balance to strike in Ukraine. So if the goal is to induce Russia to somehow withdraw from the territories it occupied since February 24th, when it invaded Ukraine, that's one thing. If the goal is to go further than that and to weaken Russia and to make this a long-term war, one has to ask oneself about what the risks could be of this spinning out of control and becoming a NATO-Russia confrontation with two nuclear superpowers involved. Nobody, not the United States, not Russia, not Ukraine, and certainly not Europe, would benefit from that. So it seems to me one has to put clear boundaries on exactly what the goal here is.
Well, with which statement, I'm still trying to weigh what you've just said and how that might happen. We must end this program because we are running out of time. But you will come back and expand on what you've just said, I hope, at a later time, Rajan.
Thank you very much, Sarwar. It's been a pleasure to talk to you as always.
Well, the pleasure has been Polaris-Live and mine personally, so thank you again for coming. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much to our viewers from around the world in taking this time to join us with Dr. Rajan Menon. We hope you'll come back again to Polaris-Live and watch some more of this program of America and China and the world. So thank you. And until the next time, goodbye.